How did Solomon's temple compare to the tabernacle built by Moses? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse by verse study of the book of 1 Kings on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Kings chapter 6 verses 1 to 13. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Kings chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Now the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height 30 cubits. The vestibule in the front of the sanctuary of the house was 20 cubits long across the width of the house, and the width of the vestibule extended 10 cubits from the front of the house. And he made for the house windows with beveled frames. Against the wall of the temple he built chambers all around, against the walls of the temple, all around the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary. Thus he made side chambers all around it. The lowest chamber was 5 cubits wide, the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. For he made narrow ledges around the outside of the temple, so that the support beams would not be fastened into the walls of the temple. And the temple, when it was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. The doorway for the middle story was on the right side of the temple. They went up by stairs to the middle story, and from the middle to the third. So he built the temple and finished it, and he paneled the temple with beams and boards of cedar. And he built side chambers against the entire temple, each 5 cubits high. They were attached to the temple with cedar beams. Then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, Concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments, and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. This chapter is going to give us the beginning of the erection of the temple of God built by Solomon in Jerusalem. It was the first temple built by the Hebrews, and so when this temple is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and later rebuilt by Zerubbabel after the captivity, that is why you often hear that period being referred to as the Second Temple period, while the era from Solomon to the captivity is the First Temple period. Verse 1 gives us the year that the temple was built, which is the 480th year after Israel came up out of Egypt. This is the only time in the Old Testament that a time period is marked by an era, for other time periods are simply marked with the inclusive time period of the event. However, with the 480th year mentioned, if we can find an anchor date that secular history records that we know for certain, then we can work backwards to this event in 1 Kings 6 and then go back and date the Exodus. Do we have such a date? Yes, for we know that Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem in 605 BC and carried off the first round of Jewish captives, which would have included Daniel and his companions. Using the chronology from 1st and 2nd Kings that we will see as we study these two books, we can step back in time to 1 Kings 6 and determine that Solomon began reigning in about 970 BC, making the 4th year of his reign about 966 BC. So add 480 years from this, and this is where we get the date of 1446 BC for the Exodus. This is where our dates of the period of the judges and the reigns of King Saul and King David come from. So in reality, the date of the Exodus really does depend on the accuracy of this number. If there had been a copyist error along the way, as is sometimes the case with other numbers in Scripture, then our dates will be off. And the reason I mention this is because other versions of the Old Testament, such as the Greek Septuagint, has the 440th year in this verse. That would push the Exodus back to 1406 BC, the date we have Israel entering the Promised Land. Now, of course, the Septuagint might have simply excluded the 40 years of wandering when translating this verse, but the phrasing of this verse really does lead us to believe that it is talking about when Israel left Egypt, not when they entered Canaan. Subtracting 40 years from the Exodus, though, would have major ramifications on the period of the Judges and the Kings thus far, as we have been able to show how the Bible chronology actually fits with 480 exactly. So that is why we are confident that 480 years is the correct rendering here as to the dating of the building of the temple. We find that the building of the temple occurred in the second month of the year, the month of Ziv, which would correspond to our late April, early May. As for the temple itself, it was much more grandiose than the tabernacle was. In order to properly compare it to the tabernacle, we must remind ourselves of the dimensions of the tabernacle. So let's go back and reread Exodus 26, verses 1 to 25. Moreover, you shall make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine woven linen and blue, purple, and scarlet thread. With artistic designs of cherubim you shall weave them. The length of each curtain shall be 28 cubits, and the width of each curtain 4 cubits. And every one of the curtains shall have the same measurements. 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another, and the other 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another. And you shall make loops of blue yarn on the edge of the curtain on the selvage of one set, and likewise you shall do on the outer curtain of the other curtain of the second set. Do on the outer edge of the other curtain of the second set. 50 loops you shall make in one curtain, and 50 loops you shall make on the edge of the curtain that is on the end of the second set. The loops may be clasped to one another. And you shall make 50 clasps of gold, and couple the curtains together with the clasps, so that it may be one tabernacle. You shall also make curtains of goat's hair to be a tent over the tabernacle. You shall make 11 curtains. The length of each curtain shall be 30 cubits, and the width of each curtain 4 cubits. And the 11 curtains shall all have the same measurements. And you shall couple 5 curtains by themselves and 6 curtains by themselves, and you shall double over the 6th curtain at the forefront of the tent. You shall make 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that is outermost in one set, and 50 loops on the edge of the curtain of the second set. And you shall make 50 bronze clasps, put the clasps into the loops, and couple the tent together, that it may be one. The remnant that remains of the curtains of the tent, the half curtain that remains, shall hang over the back of the tabernacle. And a cubit on one side and a cubit on the other side of what remains of the length of the curtains of the tent shall hang over the sides of the tabernacle, on this side and on that side, to cover it. You shall also make a covering of ram skins dyed red for the tent, and a covering of badger skins above that. And for the tabernacle you shall make the boards of acacia wood, standing upright. 10 cubits shall be the length of a board, and a cubit and a half shall be the width of each board. 2 tenons shall be in each board for the binding one to another. Thus you shall make for all the boards of the tabernacle. And you shall make the boards for the tabernacle 20 boards for the south side. You shall make 40 sockets of silver under the 20 boards, 2 sockets under each of the boards for its 2 tenons. And for the second side of the tabernacle, the north side, there shall be 20 boards, and there 40 sockets of silver, 2 sockets under each of the boards. For the far side of the tabernacle, westward, you shall make 6 boards. And you shall also make 2 boards for the 2 back corners of the tabernacle. They shall be coupled together at the bottom, and they shall be coupled together at the top by 1 ring. Thus it shall be for both of them. They shall be for the 2 corners. So there shall be 8 boards with their sockets of silver, 16 sockets, 2 sockets under each of the boards. Now I understand that that was a lot of information to throw at you so quickly, but assuming that the cubits are the same in Exodus as they are in 1 Kings, a cubit would measure about 18 inches. We read that the tabernacle was 30 cubits long, by 10 cubits wide, by 10 cubits high, meaning that it measured 45 feet long by 15 feet wide by 15 feet high. It was made of tapestry so that it could be easily moved from place to place when needed. Solomon's temple measured 60 cubits long by 20 cubits wide, or 90 feet long by 30 feet wide. Later we will also find that it stood 20 cubits tall, or 30 feet tall. The outside of the temple itself was made of stone that was finished at the quarry before moving it into place on the temple site, so that no iron tool was heard on the temple site. Thus, this would be a permanent structure. Therefore, the size of Solomon's temple was double the size of the tabernacle. Both the temple and the tabernacle would have a holy place and a most holy place, but the temple would also have things that the tabernacle didn't have. For instance, the temple itself had windows, something that the tabernacle didn't have. There were also chambers or rooms attached to the side of the temple, something that the tabernacle didn't have either. All in all, then, the temple that Solomon built was double the size of the tabernacle, and from 2 Chronicles we learn that it sat north of the current walls of the city of Jerusalem at the threshing floor purchased by David from Araunah back in 2 Samuel 24. Let's remember, though, that this wasn't the temple that Jesus stood in, for Herod's temple stood even grander than Solomon's temple, being about double the size of Solomon's temple. God told Solomon that if he followed him faithfully to keep his statutes and judgments, then God would dwell among the children of Israel at this temple and not forsake them, just as he said of the tabernacle back in Exodus 25, verse 8. The implication is that if Israel departed from following God, then God would remove his presence from there, and we do see this when the temple is destroyed later by Nebuchadnezzar. But as long as Israel followed God, they could be certain of his presence at this temple. We'll continue with the construction of the temple, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 14 to 28, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.